There were 3 of us on the mission. An officer unknown to us briefed us at the base at dusk. Tonight he will jump by parachute. He told us the target is a scientist specializing in mixing batches of new and experimental chemicals for a country whose interests do not coincide with ours. We want to convince him to work for us, preferably in his own country. They will enter quickly and cleanly. They will capture his location. It will be provided to them in transit. We were not asked if we had doubts. 30 minutes later, we were on board, and in the air, a non-commissioned officer came to meet us. He pulled out a tablet. This is a satellite image taken 6 months ago. He said we hoped to be able to give them a more recent image, and we had one from 48 hours ago. But a dense fog obscured everything, so this will have to suffice. He had a rural accent that in other circumstances might have been pleasant in the dark interior. The plane was all business. Their area of operations follows a simple grid system. There are low-rise apartments along the main avenues with shops at the intersections forming a sort of central plaza. There are also a couple of bars, a clinic, a funeral home, and a school. Everything needed for a quiet and satisfying life. The target lives in one of the big houses west of town. All have their own land. Their workplace is a mile away, just on the outskirts. Although it looks like a chemical plant for the agricultural industry, it is actually a research center. There are armed guards 24 hours a day, and they could continue patrolling without knowing of their presence if all goes as planned. Once they have the target, there will be a transport waiting for them at the extraction point, 20 miles south, just across the border, in a country with which we are on better terms. I would not invite them a beer on a Friday night, but we wouldn't get the shotgun out if we saw them in our yard. As for the entry point, it will be the old town to the northeast. There are many abandoned houses and a church with its cemetery, both still in use. The only people who could bother, there are the dead. That's all. Besides the typical advice, if you are caught, we will deny any connection with you. You are on your own. Nobody said anything on my part. I had been in covert operations for over 10 years, and none of this surprised me. Don't get me wrong, it was unpleasant, but it was my job. If I had wanted an easy life, I would be teaching golf to bored housewives on some sunny beach. I closed my eyes, slowed down my breathing, and tried to rest. 2 hours later, the signal came. It was time to jump out of a plane. Perfectly comfortable, the descent and landing went off as planned, and in a few minutes our parachutes, they were hidden as we moved silently through the cemetery. A gargoyle on a grave looked at me with disdain. I didn't take it personally. His face was made to frown to our left. The church was plunged into darkness. The only lights were the stars and a quarter moon, which suited me. I took a drink of water. Hydration is important even for night ghosts, and continued moving. Soon we reached the edge of the cemetery, and the buildings of the city became visible. The glow of the streetlights illuminated the concrete walls covered with graffiti that rose 2, sometimes 3 stories. There were entrances like the skeleton of a bicycle lay on the ground near a door. There were no lights on in any window. There were no signs of life on the streets. I looked at the clock. It was 3 in the morning. Local time. There were 4 hours left. By dawn, I signaled for us to move forward on the 2nd street, on the left. We would leave behind the blocks of low apartments, which would expose us more, but we would be only 5 minutes from the target's house. I took the front almost immediately. I raised a hand, asking us to stop. There was a light in a window at street level. Right in front, I approached and took a look. There was a man sitting in front of a flickering television. I saw him in profile. He had black dots on his face. They moved, and with disgust, I realized that they were flies. They crawled on his skin and entered his mouth and nostrils, but he did not react. I indicated to the team that we could continue, and I did not bother to bend down as I passed by the window. I looked again and said the word corpse. It seemed that he had died in front of the television, and no one had realized. Maybe when I started to smell, the neighbors would make the owner of the building take action on the matter. We continued moving forward until the curve. Without finding anything relevant, the buildings began to separate, leaving an open space, a vacant lot to our left. Although it was not a vacant lot, I realized there were gates at the ends of a concrete strip, and some trees and bushes. Although withered, they were planted in a neat pattern. It was a rather depressing park. But a park? At last, sir. One of the companions whispered, and pointed to the right. The park, like all the others, had benches. There was a man sitting on one. He was not moving. I assumed he was asleep, maybe sleeping in the open air. Maybe he had fought with his wife, and she would not let him come home. Or maybe he was so drunk he could not get there. We had no reason to wake him, and I was about to signal for us to continue when one of his legs jerked. I cursed under my breath as I saw why a rat had bitten his ankle and was pulling him. I walked over, and with horror, I saw that there were 2 other rats in his stomach. They had torn his clothes and skin and were devouring his insides. The man was not moving. He must be dead, too. I noticed his eyes were open, but that meant nothing. People die with eyes open the whole time the others were as paralyzed as I was by the scene. "Leave it," I whispered. They nodded and turned away. I was about to do the same when the man blinked. I would have sworn he did that. He moved his eyelids. Only the dead don't blink. I should have imagined it. I sure did. "Sir." A new whisper broke my concentration. We moved towards the target's house. Now I moved away from the man and the rats that were devouring him. "Yes," I replied. "Let's finish this and get out of here." We continued in silence. The houses around were on their own land, and there were cars parked next to some. The target's house was just ahead. It was dark. Heavy wooden shutters covered the windows. We circled the house looking for alarms or cameras, but there was nothing. I gave the signal to enter the door, gave after 3 kicks, and that was it. We were inside the darkness. It stretched down a hallway, beyond several closed doors. There was no reaction to our forced entry. No one screamed or attacked us. Either the house was empty, or its occupants had hidden memories of flies and rats crawling over skin and flesh. Crossed my mind. I pushed them aside and ordered a search of every room. We found him in the bathroom, curled up inside the bathtub. The shower curtain was closed as if that would change. Anything the target was about 50 years old. He wore a cheap suit, small round glasses, and his gray hair was tousled in all directions. He was crying and shaking. "We are not going to hurt you," I told him. "We will just take you with us. We will introduce you to your new best friends. Think of it as a promotion in your career." After telling him that, I smiled, as kindly as I could. He shook his head. "No, you don't. You understand," he said. "It is not you I am afraid of. No, I'm hiding from you. They I didn't understand what he was talking about, but I didn't have time to find out. We needed to move. I took him by the arm and started to lift him up, sir. One of the men interrupted me. "We have company." Where I asked on the street, "We are watching them through the broken door, dragging the target with me." I covered his mouth so he would stop protesting, and I went to look. There was a figure out there far away, but getting closer I couldn't make out details if it was a man or woman, young or old, if it was armed or a civilian. I gave the order in a low voice. We went out from the back. We headed to the back of the house before opening the back door. One of the men slightly lifted the blinds of a window, just enough to see through. He cursed and said, "There are more." I looked next to him through the opening. I counted 3 figures getting closer. Maybe there were 5. You invited your friends to a party. You murmur instantly needed information. "I'm going to take my hand away," I told him, "and you're not going to scream. Just tell me what's going on." "Okay." He nodded and took my hand away. He swallowed and said, "As long as they didn't know I was here, I would be safe. But they saw you, and now they're coming." "You keep saying," they said to him. "What do you mean?" "They were normal people who lived in this town until the accident started." And then he burst into tears. "I'm so sorry." Sob. I didn't want this to happen. I stared at him. "What happened? There was a leak. One of the new chemicals I was working on, when it mixed with the air, it turned into gas. It was everywhere. The town thought it was just fog. And after a few hours, the narrow wind dispersed it. But that was just the beginning. The beginning of the nightmare was about to continue. When I heard footsteps behind me, someone was coming through the broken front door. They weren't alone behind it. More figures crowded in, all trying to get in at the same time as the first one approached. I realized that the fact that our mission was compromised was the least of my problems. Something terrible was happening here. Something horrible. The figure that was now a few meters away, had once been human, was now an aberration. The skin of its face was pale and covered in open wounds. Its bloodshot eyes were brimming with hate. It reached out its hands forward, scratching o'er the air as he crawled. As he moved, a low, guttural moan came from his mouth. I grabbed my gun and accidentally let go of the target, who ran for the back door. "I follow him," I yelled. "You take care of these things." I didn't know what to call them. I just realized they were real. I turned and ran after the target. Applause. Behind me, the gunshots echoed in the small space. Up ahead, the target went through the back door and out onto the field. I followed him and saw he was surrounded. The 5 had become dozens. There was a multitude of the things. Their distorted moans filled the night, like a sickly voice. They all directed their hatred at the target, the scientist we had sent to spy on. He spun in circles, helpless as the creatures approached. Then they fell on him. Music. They bit. They tore and ripped. I looked away. I couldn't stand to see it, and I backed away into the house. There were no more shots. The hall was a sea of these things. Somewhere among them were men I had come with. I could only hope. They no longer felt anything that they did not understand what was happening to them. One of the creatures looked up from his frenzy. His face was stained with blood and a piece of flesh hung from his mouth. He saw me. His eyes opened wide. He slowly raised his arm. He pointed a pale finger at me and moaned. Others turned and began to move towards me. Terror broke me from paralysis, and I ran to the bathroom. There was an uncovered window. I broke it with a blow. Ignoring the pain in my hand, I snuck through it. There were trees in front of me, a path. Clara. I did not hesitate. I ran, and I entered between the thick undergrowth. Then I dropped to the ground and lay still. I remembered what the target had said about being safe, because they didn't know I was there until they saw us. I thought, with back in the house, The creatures were still gathered outside. Some were holding bones, gnawing on the last remains of flesh. Others looked around, as if confused. One raised its face to the sky and howled, a primitive and grotesque sound that froze my blood. I thought the night would never end, but finally I saw the dim light of a new day on the horizon. The light brought new sounds, a low and mechanical rumble that I recognized. Shortly after the first tank appeared by the insignia, I understood in what country I was. There were 6 tanks in total, followed by soldiers in protective suits from my hiding place. I watched the assault begin. The troops advanced, destroying the creatures, staggering towards them. The tanks crushed flesh bones, and the house itself, demolishing everything with their force. They continued forward, razing everything in their path. I understood they were eliminating the city, and everything in it, erasing any trace of what had happened. I knew my country would do the same. There would be no official records of this mission, and if I did not return, they would say that I died in a training exercise. They would give me a military funeral with a coffin full of sandbags, and if that happened, I quickly thought I would have the chance to start over with another name live, a new life, somewhere else. Dusk is approaching. I have remained motionless, hidden, and I have made a decision. I will go into the darkness. I will no longer exist. This testimony will be the only thing left